A discarded pizza crust in a Midtown Manhattan trash can. That is what it took to unmask a serial killer who hid in plain sight for over a decade. On July 13th, 2023, the silence of the Gilgo Beach cold case was finally shattered when plainclothes officers swarmed a 59-year-old architect on a busy sidewalk. Rex Heuermann was a man who spent his mornings at high-stakes city meetings and his nights, allegedly, hunting the most vulnerable members of society. For 13 years, he lived in a decaying suburban house just miles from where he left a trail of bodies, convinced that his meticulous architectural precision had made him invisible to the law. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the hunter, one must first examine the blueprint of his life. A life built on a foundation of extreme technicality and a carefully curated facade of suburban normalcy. Rex Heuermann was not a drifter or a ghost on the fringes of society. He was a man of significant stature, both physically and professionally. Standing 6'4" and weighing over 240 pounds, he was a mountain of a man who commanded attention in the boardrooms of Manhattan, only to retreat into a crumbling, shadowed existence in the quiet village of Massapequa Park. The house at 105 First Avenue was more than just a residence. It was a relic. It was the same house where Rex had grown up, a small, red-shingled structure that seemed to shrink under the weight of the overgrown trees and the clutter of a man who refused to let go of the past. He purchased the home from his mother in the mid-1990s, effectively anchoring himself to the very soil where his own childhood memories were buried. To his neighbors, Rex was the guy with the overgrown lawn, a prickly, awkward figure who was often seen looking through his windows or standing in his driveway, watching the world go by with a detached, unsettling intensity. He was known to be meticulous about his property lines, often warning neighbors to keep their children or their pets away from his dirt. Every morning, Rex would step out of this decaying time capsule, dressed in a crisp suit or a professional sweater, and board the Long Island Railroad at the Massapequa Park station. He was one of thousands of commuters, just another face in a sea of gray heading toward Penn Station. But in Midtown Manhattan, Rex was a man of influence. In 1994, he founded R.H. Consultants and Associates, an architectural firm located on Fifth Avenue. He wasn't just an architect, he was a fixer. In the Byzantine world of the New York City Department of Buildings, Rex was a master of the code. He knew every loophole, every technicality, and every permit requirement. He was the man developers hired when they had a problem that seemed impossible to solve. He was technical, he was precise, and he was, above all, obsessed with the rules. Colleagues remembered him as a man who could talk for hours about the specifics of a building's egress or the chemical composition of fireproofing, but he lacked the warmth of basic human connection. He was often described as brazen and highly intelligent, a man who used his superior knowledge of the city's infrastructure to dominate those around him. This professional life was his armor, a suit of legitimacy that allowed him to walk through the most crowded streets in the world, while harboring secrets that were, quite literally, buried in the sand. At home, the architect was a husband and a father. He had been married to his second wife, Asa Ellerup, for over 20 years. To the outside world, they were a standard, if somewhat eccentric, family. Asa was often seen gardening or walking, while Rex remained a more reclusive figure. But inside the home, the environment was vastly different from the sleek glass and steel offices of Fifth Avenue. The Massapequa Park house was a labyrinth of clutter, filled with old furniture, woodworking tools, and, most notably, an arsenal of weapons. Rex was an avid gun collector, holding permits for over 92 firearms and reportedly keeping hundreds more in a locked walk-in vault in his basement. This vault, a room within a room, would later become a central point of the investigation. It was a place where Rex could indulge in his hobbies of woodworking and weapon maintenance, far from the prying eyes of his family or the neighbors. It was here, in the cold darkness of the basement, that the two halves of his life converged. The precision of the architect and the lethality of the collector were fused together. He lived a life of extreme compartmentalization. He could spend his lunch break in Manhattan, using burner phones to contact sex workers. and then returned to a city planning meeting to discuss the safety of a high-rise. By 2026, we now know that his architect persona was not just a job, it was his methodology. He treated his predatory behavior like a construction project. There were checklists, there were blueprints. There was a systematic approach to the disposal of what he considered waste. He believed that as long as he followed the code he had created for himself, he was untouchable. He was a man who spent 40 years learning how to hide things in plain sight, within the walls of buildings and within the confines of his own mind. He was the architect of his own nightmare, building a double life so sturdy that it took over a decade for a single crack to appear in the foundation. To understand the true scale of the horror, one must look at the geography of the Hunt, a desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the brush of Long Island. This wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a curated gallery of disposal. The killer didn't choose this place by accident. He chose it because he knew the terrain. He knew that the thick, thorny vines and the salt-crusted sand would swallow a body in weeks. For years, the Gilgo Four lay just feet from the asphalt. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters who had fallen through the cracks of a society that often looked the other way. And Rex Heuermann was allegedly the man who reached out from the shadows to pull them under. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first to vanish into the Long Island mist in July 2007. She was a 25-year-old mother of two from Connecticut who had traveled to New York City to make ends meet. She was described by those who knew her as a woman with a big heart who was doing her best to provide for her children in a world that offered very few easy paths. When she disappeared after leaving her hotel near Penn Station, the silence was immediate and devastating. Her family reached out to the authorities, but in the pre-smartphone era, a missing person from out of state often fell into a bureaucratic void. Maureen was the pioneer of this tragic group, the first to be wrapped in burlap and left in the dunes, a secret that Heuermann allegedly kept to himself while he continued his daily commute past her resting place for the next 16 years. 2 years later, in July 2009, Melissa Barthelemy followed the same tragic arc. She was 24, originally from Buffalo, but living in a small apartment in the Bronx. She was a dreamer who wanted to open her own salon, a young woman with a sharp wit and a fierce protective streak over her younger sister, Amanda. Melissa was last seen walking away from her apartment, heading toward a meeting she believed would help her secure her future. But the most chilling aspect of Melissa's case wasn't just her disappearance. It was what happened next. For weeks after she vanished, a man used her cell phone to call her teenage sister. He didn't just call, he taunted her. He told Amanda in a calm, flat voice that he had killed her sister, describing the act with a clinical detachment that suggested a total lack of empathy. These calls were placed from crowded areas like Madison Square Garden and the Port Authority, places where the architect could blend into the thousands of commuters, hiding his monstrous words behind the white noise of the city. The summer of 2010 brought the disappearance of Megan Waterman, a 22-year-old mother from Maine. She was in New York with her boyfriend, staying at a Holiday Inn Express in Hoposh, Long Island. On a June night, she walked out of the hotel lobby, captured on grainy surveillance footage that would haunt her family for a decade. She left behind a 3-year-old daughter who would grow up asking questions that no one could answer. Megan was a woman who loved the ocean, an irony that would become bitter when her remains were found just miles from the hotel where she was last seen. The investigation into her disappearance was initially hampered by the very people supposed to protect her, law enforcement who viewed her lifestyle as a reason to deprioritize her life. Then there was Amber Costello, the final piece of the Gilgo Four. She was 27 and living in West Babylon, just a short drive from Heuermann's home. Amber was struggling with addiction, a vulnerability that the predator allegedly exploited with surgical precision. But unlike the others, Amber's disappearance in September 2010 left behind a crucial witness. Her roommates remembered a man who had called her repeatedly, a man she referred to as the Ogre because of his massive physical presence. They saw a dark-colored Chevrolet Avalanche parked in the driveway, and they watched as Amber walked out to meet him. She thought she was going to a high-paying job that would help her turn her life around. Instead, she was walking into a trap set by a man who lived only a few miles away, a neighbor who knew the local backroads as well as he knew the blueprints on his desk. By 2026, the narrative has expanded far beyond these four women. The investigation into Rex Heuermann has reached back decades, linking him to the brutalized remains of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. Jessica was only 20 when she was found in 2003. Her body mutilated in a way that suggested the killer wanted to erase her identity, a signature of someone who viewed human beings as materials to be altered or discarded. Sandra Costilla's case takes us back even further, to 1993, suggesting that Heuermann wasn't just a late bloomer in the world of serial violence. He was a lifelong predator who had perfected his craft long before the internet made his hunting easier. The hunting ground was more than just the dunes of Gilgo Beach. It was the entire infrastructure of the tri-state area. Heuermann allegedly used his knowledge of the city's blind spots, the public phones that no one watched, the transit hubs where anonymity was guaranteed, and the vast, unlit stretches of the parkway to create a kill zone that spanned 30 years. He targeted women who were often ignored by the system, betting that no one would miss them and that the police wouldn't look too hard. He was right for a long time. The dunes became a mass grave of stories cut short, a testament to a man who treated the lives of these women like architectural debris, something to be cleared away to make room for his own twisted designs. Each victim was a life full of potential, reduced to a cold case file because a man with a Fifth Avenue office and a basement vault decided that his desires outweighed their right to exist. The architect moniker was never just a professional title. It was a psychological blueprint for murder. In the world of Rex Heuermann, there was no room for chaos. Every action was a calculated structural element in a bridge toward total control. By 2026, the full scope of his planning document, a digital manifesto discovered on a hidden hard drive, has revealed a mind that treated human life with the same cold, material indifference as a load-bearing wall. This wasn't a man driven by sudden, blind rages. He was a man who drafted his crimes, edited them, and archived the lessons learned for future projects. The HK 2002 document, as it was labeled in the case files, is perhaps the most disturbing artifact in modern criminal history. It was a literal manual for serial murder. Under headers like pre-prep and the attack, Heuermann allegedly cataloged everything from the necessary supplies, burlap, heavy-duty tape, and cleaning agents, to the tactical requirements of a successful disposal. He emphasized the need for a clean vehicle and noted that light was the enemy of the hunt. This document showed that he viewed his victims not as people, but as obstacles to be managed, or as problems to be solved through architectural precision. He even wrote notes to himself about how to improve next time, detailing the physical resistance he encountered and how to more efficiently silence it. This clinical detachment is what allowed him to remain undetected. He wasn't looking for a thrill, he was looking for a perfect execution of a plan. His use of technology was equally systematic. Heuermann didn't just stumble upon his victims, he mined the digital landscape with the same tenacity he used to navigate New York City building codes. He utilized dozens of burner phones, purchasing them in cash at local drugstores and activating them only when he was far from his suburban home. He would place these phones in safe zones, like Midtown Manhattan or busy transit hubs, ensuring that even if a signal were traced, it would disappear into the white noise of 10 million other pings. He believed that by separating his real phone from his work phones, he had created an impenetrable firewall. However, he underestimated the patience of modern data analysts. By 2024, investigators had successfully mapped his movements, showing that his personal cell phone and his burner devices were frequently pinging the same towers at the same times, a digital shadow that he never realized he was casting. Then there was the ogre persona, the raw physical dominance that he leveraged once the planning phase was complete. To his clients on Fifth Avenue, he was a sophisticated consultant. To his victims, he was a massive, terrifying presence who used his size to instill immediate, paralyzing fear. Amber Costello's roommates had dubbed him the Ogre because of his 6'4" frame and his unsettling, lumbering gait. He would allegedly lure these women with the promise of high-paying jobs, only to reveal his true nature the moment they were isolated. He used his massive hands as his primary tools, a signature of strangulation that spoke to a need for direct, tactile control over the moment of death. The architect didn't want to use a tool that created distance. He wanted to feel the life leave the body. A final, horrific confirmation of his power. The digital trail he left behind was a descent into a specific kind of madness. Forensic examinations of his devices revealed over 200 searches for Long Island serial killer and Gilgo Beach bodies. He wasn't just curious, he was obsessed with his own legacy. He would spend hours reading news articles about the investigation, likely scoffing at the ineptitude of the police while he refined his own techniques based on their failures. Alongside these searches were thousands of inquiries into extreme torture and child exploitation material, a dark digital library that fueled his real-world impulses. He was a man who lived in a constant feedback loop of predatory consumption, using the internet to sharpen his appetites and then using his professional knowledge to satisfy them in the physical world. The house in Massapequa Park served as the physical epicenter of this modus operandi. The basement vault, a soundproofed, reinforced room, became a focal point of the 2024 and 2025 forensic sweeps. While it housed his collection of nearly 100 firearms, investigators began to look closer at the very concrete of the structure. In 2026, it is widely understood that this vault was his inner sanctum, a place where he could transition from the architect to the predator without fear of interruption. The soundproofing wasn't just for his woodworking or gun maintenance. It was a structural necessity for a man who kept secrets that had to remain unheard. He treated the house like a fortress, maintaining a perimeter of overgrown brush and clutter that acted as a natural screen against the curious eyes of neighbors. Ultimately, Heuermann's methodology was based on a fundamental belief in his own superiority. He believed that because he understood the systems of the city, the transit, the codes, the digital networks, he could manipulate them to hide his true self. He treated the legal and social framework of New York like a blueprint with a hidden flaw that only he could see. He didn't just kill, he managed the disappearances. He didn't just hide bodies, he distributed them according to a plan that accounted for tides, vegetation, and police patrol patterns. His life was a monument to compartmentalization, a structure built on the assumption that as long as the exterior remained professional and up to code, no one would ever think to look at the rot in the foundation. But like any structure built on a lie, it only took one small forensic crack for the entire edifice to come crashing down. The decade of silence that followed the discovery of the bodies was not a lack of evidence. It was a structural collapse of the justice system. The stagnation began with a cry for help that had nothing to do with the Gilgo 4, at least not initially. In the pre-dawn hours of May 1st, 2010, a young woman named Shannon Gilbert placed a frantic 911 call from the gated community of Oak Beach. For 23 minutes, she remained on the line, her voice thick with a raw, primal terror that transcended the static. She told the dispatcher that someone was after her, that they were trying to kill her. She was seen by residents running through the shadows, knocking on doors, and begging for safety before she vanished into the impenetrable salt marshes. When the police finally arrived, they didn't find Shannon. They found the start of a mystery that would take 13 years to unspool. 7 months later, in December 2010, a K-9 officer and his German Shepherd were conducting what they thought was a routine training exercise along a desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway. They were looking for any sign of Shannon's remains. Instead, in the dense, skeletal brush of the dunes, the dog caught a scent that didn't belong to the salt air. Buried in the brambles was a set of skeletal remains wrapped in a camouflage-patterned burlap. It wasn't Shannon. Within days, the search intensified, and 3 more sets of remains were discovered, all within 500 feet of each other, all positioned with a clinical precision that suggested a systematic disposal. The Gilgo 4 had been found, but the man who put them there was already drifting back into the anonymity of the New York commute. The following spring, in 2011, the horror expanded. As the snow melted and the brush was cleared, the dunes gave up more secrets. Investigators found the remains of a toddler, an unidentified Asian male, and several other women, some of whom were linked to remains found years earlier in Manorville. The 15-mile stretch of Ocean Parkway had become a graveyard. This should have triggered the most significant multi-agency task force in New York history. Instead, the investigation entered a period of professional paralysis. The Suffolk County Police Department, under the leadership of then-Chief James Burke, became an island unto itself, shrouded in a culture of secrecy and old-school loyalties that prioritized internal protection over external cooperation. Burke famously barred the FBI from participating in the investigation, a move that many now believe was a calculated attempt to keep federal eyes away from the department's own dark corners. During this lost decade, the case sat on a shelf, gathering dust while the architect continued to board the train to Manhattan every morning. Evidence that would later prove crucial, a belt embossed with the initials HM or WH, DNA from the burlap, and witness accounts of a dark Chevrolet Avalanche, wasn't processed with the urgency it deserved. The leads were left to dry up, and the families of the victims were left in a state of suspended, agonizing grief. They watched as the media circus surrounding Shannon Gilbert, whose death was eventually ruled an accidental drowning in the marsh, overshadowed the systematic murders of the other women. For the families, like the Bartholomews, this decade was a second victimization. They dealt with a police department that seemed more interested in managing its public image than in chasing a killer. Every time a new lead appeared, it seemed to vanish into the same bureaucratic void. Meanwhile, Rex Heuermann lived his life with a sense of total invulnerability. He likely watched the news, saw the infighting between the FBI and the local cops, and felt a twisted sense of pride. He was a man who understood systems, and he saw that the system supposed to catch him was fundamentally broken. He continued to tend his garden in Massapequa Park, just a few miles north of the dunes, where he had allegedly left a trail of bodies, convinced that time and the salt air had already washed away his sins. It wasn't that the killer was a genius, it was that the gatekeepers were looking the other way. The long stagnation was a period of silence that allowed a monster to believe he had built a life that was, quite literally, above the law. The pivot didn't come from a new crime. It came from a new perspective. In early 2022, the static of the long stagnation was finally broken when Rodney Harrison took over as Suffolk County Police Commissioner. He didn't just want a review of the case, he wanted a war room. He formed the Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force, bringing together the FBI, state police, and local investigators into a single high-intensity unit. They didn't start with the bodies. They started with the paperwork that had been ignored for a decade. They went back to a tip from 2010, a witness description from Amber Costello's roommates that had been buried in the files. They had described a man, a mountain of a man, driving a first-generation dark green Chevrolet Avalanche. In 2010, the Avalanche was a unique vehicle, a hybrid between an SUV and a pickup with distinctive plastic cladding along the sides. Using modern database searching, the task force filtered for every registered Avalanche in the tri-state area that matched the description, and cross-referenced them with individuals who had the physical stature of a giant. One name surged to the top of the list: Rex Heuermann. He didn't just own the truck, he lived in Massapequa Park, right in the center of the kill zone, and his office was in Midtown Manhattan, exactly where the taunting calls to Melissa Barthelomew's sister had originated. The architect had been hiding behind a wall of technicalities, but he had left a digital shadow he couldn't erase. Investigators began a deep dive into his financial and cellular records, uncovering a pattern that was as precise as a blueprint. They found that Heuermann had used a series of burner phones, many of which were purchased under aliases like Andrew Roberts, to contact sex workers and search for details about the Gilgo investigation. But the breakthrough was the American Express lead. Heuermann had used his own credit card to pay for a Tinder account under a fake name, which was linked to the same burner devices used to contact the victims. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a structural link. The man who was so meticulous about building codes had forgotten to sanitize his digital billing. The surveillance wasn't just about the digital trail, It was about the psychology of the hunt. The investigators noted his behavior, the way he would stop and look around, a predatory habit of checking his six that had likely served him well for 3 decades. He was a creature of habit, yet he remained hyper-aware of his surroundings. At his office, he was a different man, loud, demanding, and often abrasive with city officials. This contrast was fascinating to the teams watching him. They saw the fixer who could bully a bureaucrat into approving a permit. And then they saw the man who would spend hours in the basement of his home, often with the lights off, just sitting in his truck in the driveway. By early 2023, the task force was no longer just investigating, they were stalking. They placed Heuermann under 24-hour surveillance. For months, undercover teams watched him navigate the streets of Manhattan, a 6'4" figure in a beige coat, blending into the crowds of Fifth Avenue. They watched him at the train station. They watched him at his office. They were waiting for a single piece of biological evidence that would bridge the gap between the living man and the cold remains in the dunes. The moment came in January 2023, outside his office in Midtown. The architect stepped out for lunch and walked to a nearby pizza shop. He was observed eating a couple of slices before walking to a trash can on Fifth Avenue and discarding the cardboard box. Inside was a single half-eaten pizza crust. The surveillance team moved in within seconds of his departure, recovering the box with surgical care. It was a race against the city's street sweepers. This piece of discarded trash was rushed to a lab for mitochondrial DNA testing, a specialized technique used when traditional nuclear DNA is degraded or unavailable. The lab compared the DNA from that crust to a single hair, a light-colored hair that had been recovered from the burlap wrapping around Megan Waterman's remains in 2010. For 13 years, that hair had been a ghost in the evidence locker. The results were undeniable. The DNA from the Fifth Avenue pizza crust matched the hair on the victim with a probability of 160 to 1. The architect was no longer just a suspect, he was the source. The task force also leveraged tower dumps from 2010, data that had been sitting in storage for over a decade. By 2024, the processing power available to law enforcement allowed them to cross-reference thousands of phone numbers that had pinged the same towers as the burner phones in Massapequa and Midtown. Every time a burner phone was active, Heuermann's personal cell was either in the same sector or was suspiciously powered down. This was the electronic fingerprint of a man who thought he was playing a game of digital chess, only to realize he had been playing against a computer that never forgot a move. When the pizza box evidence came back in June 2023, the energy in the task force changed from pursuit to preparation. They knew that if they moved too soon, they might miss the chance to link him to the other victims. They began to monitor his internet traffic in real time, watching as he searched for updates on the Gilgo Beach serial killer and looked at photos of the very women he was accused of killing. He was reliving the crimes, using the media's coverage as a way to fuel his narcissism. The final days of the investigation were a masterclass in tension. They watched him as he continued his mundane routine, buying groceries, taking the train, attending meetings, all while they prepared the warrants that would dismantle his life. On July 13th, 2023, the trap was finally sprung. As Heuermann walked down the sidewalk toward the Massapequa Park train station, he was surrounded by officers. He didn't run, he didn't fight. He simply looked at them with the same flat, clinical expression he had used in boardrooms for 40 years, asking if it was finally over. The pivot was complete. The man who had built a life on hiding things in plain sight had finally run out of places to hide. The architect's tower of lies had finally suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The courtroom in 2026 was a place of sterile, final reckoning. The architect, once a figure of imposing authority, sat slumped, a shadow of the man who had dominated Manhattan boardrooms. By the time the final trial concluded, the charges had metastasized. He was no longer just a suspect in the Gilgo 4 cases. In 2024 and 2025, a mountain of new forensic evidence, extracted from the labyrinthine clutter of his Massapequa Park basement, connected him to the brutalized remains of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Custela. The basement vault was more than a storage space for his 92 firearms. It was a digital graveyard. Investigators recovered terabytes of data that mapped his predatory excursions back to the early 90s. The most damning evidence remained biological. Advanced genetic genealogy, the same tool that originally broke the case, linked his DNA to evidence found on victims he thought he had successfully erased decades ago. During the sentencing, the families finally stood before him. They spoke to the memory of the women he tried to treat as architectural waste. Heuermann remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on a point above the judge's head, as if he were mentally drafting a plan to escape a structure he no longer controlled. In early 2026, the judge delivered the inevitable: multiple consecutive life sentences without parole. The architect would spend his remaining days in a cell, a space designed with a lack of egress that even he could not negotiate. The dunes of Gilgo Beach are quiet now. The tall grass sways in the Atlantic wind, but the shadow that loomed over Ocean Parkway for decades has finally lifted. The architect is gone, locked in a world of concrete and steel he can never rebuild. The names of the women he tried to erase are now etched into a memorial that stands as a silent guard against the salt and the spray. Rex Heuermann learned a final, unavoidable lesson. No matter how meticulous the blueprint, the foundation was always built on sand. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.